Unit 3, Chapter 16, The South and the Slavery Controversy from 1793 to 1860. Early in the mid-1700s to the mid-1860s, slavery had begun dying out, despite the fact that the cotton gin had driven plantation owners to keep their slaves as they continued to produce a high-profit investment in cotton. The South up until that point had controlled about 75% of Britain's cotton originating from the South. The economic structure in the South had become more anti-competitive since the plantation system had become more financially unstable. Also, there was an over-speculation of land, causing many planters to plunge into a deep-seated debt. There was a larger white majority, and the less wealthy slave owners were below the more wealthy slave owners. They were often called poor white trash and hillbillies. The mountain whites also lived in the valley of the Appalachian Range, when civilization hadn't reached them yet. There was also the Black Belt region, where a majority of the slaves were concentrated, stretched from South Carolina and Georgia into Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, while blacks had managed to sustain the family life under slavery. The blacks had molded their own distinctive religious forms from a mixture of Christian and African elements. However, slaves were not allowed to read, since reading potentially brought them ideas, and those ideas could eventually turn into public unrest. Much of the slavery in the South was known as the Peculiar Institution. In 1832, many of these states had been moving to make an emancipation of any kind illegal. This nullification crisis of 1832 caused the voice of white Southerners to be silenced. Chapter 17, Manifest Destiny and its Legacy from 1841 to 1848. Initially, both Whigs, Daniel Webster and Henry Clay, were Secretary of State. Henry Harrison contracted pneumonia, and 4 weeks into the term he died, hampering the Webster-Clay plan. The Fiscal Corporation had been vetoed by President Tyler. He then signed the Tariff of 1842, which had been a protective Whig tariff. Then, during the 19th century, there was quite a bit of tension and hatred of Britain, sparking the Third War with England, while in 1837 there was a small rebellion in Canada. When the Lone Star of Texas shone through in the 8 years since 1836, Mexico had considered Texas as a province in the revolt and refused to recognize Texas's independence. Mexico was susceptible to war. Later, in the election of 1844, the Whig Party chose Henry Clay, while the Democrats chose James K. Polk as the Speaker of the House of Representatives for 4 years, while the Governor of Tennessee was in office for 2 terms. He had beat Henry Clay in order to win the election of 1844, nicknamed Young Hickory, stating that he would protect Texas and avoided the issue of slavery. In the 1840s and 1850s, many of the Americans felt that God had, in a sense, manifestly destined the American population to rule over the entirety of the continent. Clay straddled the issue of whether or not to annex Texas. Eventually, on January 13, 1846, Polk ordered approximately 4,000 men under General Zachary Taylor to the Rio Grande, and on May 9, 1846, Polk had requested that Congress officially declare war on Mexico on the basis of unpaid claims, in addition to Slidell's rejection of the purchasing in California. And finally, the Mexican War had provided the field experience for the officers that had been proposed to become generals from the beginning, including Captain Robert E. Lee and Lieutenant Ulysses S. Grant. Seeing as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was made in 1848, giving that area of Texas to America. Chapter 18, Renewing the Sectional Struggle from 1848 to 1854. Popular sovereignty meant that the sovereign people of a particular territory should determine the status of slavery. It was extremely popular with politicians simply because it was a comfortable compromise between the abolitionists as well as the slaveholders. Eventually, the Whigs who had met in Philadelphia chose Zachary Taylor as their candidate for presidency, and Taylor did not have an actual official bearing on slavery, yet owned many slaves himself. Through this, the Free Soil Party emerged and was originally formed by the anti-slavery men of the North who refused to trust Cass or Taylor. Zachary Taylor ended up winning the election of 1848 and was then sworn into office in 1849. Soon enough, in 1848, gold was discovered, and the rush of people in search of gold in California brought forth quite a bit of violence and disease that had the small government in California in complete disarray. Chapter 19, Drifting Toward Disunion from 1854 to 1861. The territory of Kansas had erupted into violence through the 1855 pro-slavery and anti-slavery arguments, including the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was a white, published the story Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852 as an attempt to show the North all of the horrors that slavery displayed. Statistics had attempted to be used to prove these so-called facts. James Buchanan was the one who won the election of 1856, and it was quite possible that the fact that the Republican Party did not win the election was actually a good thing, since some Southerners said that the election of a Republican president would mean that the war was forcing them to secede. The election was only a small victory for the Republican Party. Dred Scott, on the other hand, had a slave who had lived with his master for approximately 5 years in Illinois and Wisconsin Territory, who was sued for his freedom, predicated upon the residence of free soil. Lincoln ran against the Democrat Stephen Douglas. He had challenged Douglas to a series of 7 different debates that came from Freeport, Illinois. Abolitionist John Brown's scheme was to invade the South secretly with a handful of followers, calling upon the slaves to rise and give the slaves weapons while establishing a black free state as well as a sanctuary. The Republican Party then met in Chicago and nominated Abraham Lincoln as their presidential candidate, while the Republican platform had an appeal to almost every single part of the nation. Lastly, Abraham Lincoln, after winning the election of 1860, did not win the popular vote, and South Carolina now had a reason to secede in their eyes. Southern states as a whole soon said farewell to the Union. They assumed that northern manufacturers wouldn't cut themselves off from the South. Chapter 20, Girding for War, the North and the South, 1861 to 1865. The president of the time, Abraham Lincoln, declared the secession was completely impractical because both the North and South were not geographically divided, and also stated that secession and new controversies would arise that included the national debt, federal territories, and the fugitive slave issue. After Lincoln was elected, there were only approximately 2 significant forts located in the South that flew the Union's flag. Fort Sumter was in the Charleston harbor and needed the correct supplies in order to support its men. Therefore, Lincoln was then adopted into a middle-of-the-road solution. He told the South that the North had been sending provisions to the fort itself and not to the supplies for reinforcement. These 11 seceded states were known as the Submissionists, and Lincoln had a reason to now hold an armed response as he called upon the Union states to supply militiamen. The South also had the advantage of fighting defensively by itself and did not need to win in order to preserve the Confederacy. Many of these tribes were allowed to send other delegates to the Confederacy Congress. A majority of the Plains Indians sided with the Union. The South had the advantage of fighting on the defensive side for its own land, seeing as it did not have to win in order to successfully win the war. The Trent Affair occurred in late 1861, where the Trent removing 2 Confederate diplomats who were heading to Europe. The North later had an economic boom, and mechanical reapers allowed men to leave farms for war. But the North's blockade greatly harmed the economy of the South, and transportation collapsed during the Civil War. In essence, cotton capitalism had lost out to industrial capitalism. Chapter 21, The Furnace of Civil War, 1861 to 1865. President Abraham Lincoln had concluded that an attack on a smaller Confederate force at Bull Run would be worth trying, because if they were successful, the victory would display the superiority of the Union arms and may even eventually lead to the capture of Richmond. For instance, on July 21, 1861, the Union and Confederate forces met up, and the Union victory was thought to be entirely inevitable. However, the Confederates wound up winning just as Stonewall Jackson could hold up his line of Confederate soldiers until the final reinforcements were able to arrive. General Robert E. Lee then launched a counterattack against the Union forces, and the 7 days of battles were prevalent from June 26 until July 2, 1862, which then drove McClellan's forces all the way back to the sea. In order to compensate for the strong blockades, many ships were developed, and some of the quicker ships were able to break the blockades up until the latter part of the war, when the blockades were strengthened. The Emancipation Proclamation had called for the freeing of all the slaves in Confederate territory, aside from locations where the Union had mostly regained the bulk of its control. Soon after the Emancipation Proclamation, quite a few black people were permitted to enlist in the Union Army, but towards the tail end of the war, the Confederacy let the blacks enlist. However, it was too late by that time. The failure of General George Pickett's charge had qualified the Union victory. Because the Union won the battle instead, Lincoln had not allowed any negotiations. Eventually, after Stephen A. Douglas, the leader of the Democratic Party in the North, passed away, the party split fully down the middle between supporters of Lincoln and the radical Republicans who resented the expansion of the presidential power during the war, in addition to those who pressed Lincoln into emancipation, as well as eventually splitting war Democrats who supported Lincoln and those who didn't, who were known as peace Democrats. President Lincoln chose the General Grant to lead the assault on the Confederate capital of Richmond. The aftermath of the assassination of Lincoln during 1865, who was shot and killed at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth, resulted in Andrew Johnson taking over as president. Finally, the Civil War unfortunately claimed over 600 lives, while costing approximately $15 billion. Chapter 22, The Ordeal of Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. There was starting to be issues with peace, and all leaders were pardoned by President Johnson in 1868. And while the emancipation took an uneven effect in separate parts of the conquered Confederacy, some slaves were resisting liberation of the Union armies as a result of their loyalty to their own ministers, while education was also rising for the blacks due to that very proclamation. Blacks finally had the opportunity to read and write for themselves. Later, the Freedmen's Bureau, or those who were freed by slavery, consisted of people who were entirely unskilled, unlettered, and were without any form of property or money, all with little knowledge on how to survive sufficiently as free people. Congress brought this to pass in 1865. It had been meant to provide clothing, medical care, food, and education for freedmen and white refugees alike, but became expired in 1872. The 10% Reconstruction Plan was issued in 1863. This consisted of an oath of allegiance and took place near the election of 1860. President Johnson also issued his own personal Reconstruction Plan in 1865, soon leading to the ratifying of the slave-freeing 13th Amendment. Later, the Black Codes held a series of laws that were designed to regulate the affairs of the emancipation slaves. Mississippi passed the first such law in November of 1865, and these codes were made to ensure that a stable and subservient labor force was enacted. Later in December of 1865, Southern states represented themselves in Congress along with the former Confederate generals and colonels. This also included the bill that extended the life of the controversial Freedmen's Bureau that was eventually repassed. Then, on March 2, 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Act. Soon, the Invisible Empire of the South, which was also known as the Ku Klux Klan, was founded in Tennessee in 1866. Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act in 1867 that required the President to secure the consent of the Senate before he could remove his cabinet members. Eventually, the Secretary of State, William Seward, signed a treaty with Russia giving Alaska to the United States for $7.2 million. However, most of the white Southerners thought that the Reconstruction efforts were more painful, among other problems.